Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to be talking about humanoids. I've got 10 really fascinating cases. The title of today's episode is, I Was Never So Terrified in My Life, 10 Astounding Humanoid Encounters. So these 10 cases I have for you today date from 1969 to 2018 and come from all over the world, including Finland, England, Puerto Rico, Georgia, New Jersey, and Ohio, and finally Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Texas, and Wisconsin. These involve quite a variety of ETs. Some of these cases are quite scary, some are quite benevolent. We often see a bell curve into how people react. But each of these cases I think are important because they have some unique elements. Some are very well verified, some are multiple witness cases, and I've said this before, each and every case adds to our knowledge of what's going on here. So let's just get started. First case I want to talk about today is so interesting. I call this extraterrestrial house guests. This occurred sometime in the early 1950s in Corby New Town, England. And I like this case. It's very benevolent. It involves really a credible witness. It was thoroughly investigated by an experienced researcher, and it's so unusual. This case comes from Peter A. Hill, the chairman for the Wessex Association for the Study of Unexplained Phenomenon, who published the case in the Flying Saucer Review Case Histories, the August 1973 issue. The witness is a state-registered nurse at Kettering General Hospital and the wife of a police officer, and she was agreeable to having her real name published, but the husband decided not to out of respect for her husband. So she is known only as Mrs. R. At the time of her encounter, she lived at Corby New Town in England in a modern flat in the police station overlooking the town center, so a pretty urban area. It was a June morning in the early 1950s, around 5:50 a.m. Her husband was on duty, so she was alone in bed at their flat. Suddenly, an object floated through the bedroom window. The window was open. Mrs. R first thought it might be a leaf, but looking down at the carpet where this thing had landed, she said it looked more like a glass cruet set. And as she studied it, it gradually faded away. But things were about to get much stranger, because at that moment the door to her flat opened and three human-looking men entered. And while they looked human, their appearance was quite unusual, as they had a golden complexion and were wearing shiny, black, skin-tight clothing. The men smiled at her and began to communicate with her telepathically. And one of them asked her, "Did you get our visiting card?" And she replied, "The spaceship?" And the telepathic reply was, "Only a visiting card. We come from a very happy planet, and where we live is very beautiful." So they then proceeded to ask her if she would actually like to visit their planet. Now Mrs. R was doubtful about this invitation, but she asked if her husband and mother could accompany her, and they told her that no, her husband could not go because he was not of the same, quote, thought range. Mrs. R told them then that she would love to go, but it would have to be another time. So that ended the conversation. At this point, the men just disappeared from view. And while this story is admittedly very unusual, after interviewing the witness face to face, the researcher Peter A. Hill says, and I quote, "I am of the opinion that the witness is sincere and genuinely believes this strange story. She sent it to me in writing on April 26, 1973, and repeated it without any variation over a month later, without any reference to any notes. Her mother believes Miss R to be telling the truth, while her husband told me he is, quote, open-minded. There was no possible motive for a hoax or deception. She sought neither publicity nor financial gain and had told very few people about her experience. In my opinion, having interviewed the witness at considerable length, she is perfectly sincere." Now, during her interview with the researcher, Mrs. R did add that she was not at all nervous during this encounter, and she felt as though she had been prepared in some way for this experience. Definitely a unique and amazing case. There's not a whole lot of cases where people are able to hold a fairly lengthy conversation with ETs, Yeah, it wasn't a long conversation, but there was a conversation. It was really interesting. It's such a shame she didn't take them up on their offer to go visit their planet. That might have made it, of course, it would have made it a much more extensive encounter. But it's certainly an interesting one, and one that I think has kind of slid under the radar. It's not very well known. I love covering these lesser known cases. And here's another one that I'm pretty sure you haven't heard of before, but I also find it fascinating because this does involve a lengthy conversation with what appear to be ETs. So I call this one a conversation with an alien. This occurred on October 17, 1969 in Turku, Finland. And this one is very unusual. It's got unique elements I have never heard before, so I think you'll find it fascinating. This very unusual case comes from researcher Timo Paihala, chairman of the Finnish Interplanetary Society, and it was first published in the Vemana issue number 2, 1971, but was also later reprinted in the Flying Saucer Journal Case Histories issue number 8. It is a single witness case, a 47-year-old man known only by his initials, NN. It was on the evening of October 17, 1969, that Mr. NN had just come home from work. He was in his home in Turku, Helsinki, Finland, and was standing by the kitchen sink squeezing some fresh juice for himself when he suddenly felt himself being pulled gently forwards, and then so vigorously that he was forced to take a few steps backwards. So he looked down at his body to see the cause of this, and was absolutely astonished to see an anomalous, quote, streak of light, just a few inches wide, that had come under his armpits and coiled around his chest. Looking more closely at it, he saw that it was dark on the bottom and had golden yellow spots rippling along it lengthwise. So he turned around, and he now saw a bright orb of light, 3 to 4 inches wide, hovering about 3 feet above the floor of his home and 12 feet away from him. Then, coming from above him, he heard a voice speaking softly, and this voice said, "We are from another solar system, and we have something to tell you." So the witness at this point thought this must be a joke of some kind, and that someone outside was responsible. So he went to the window, opened it, looked outside, but nobody was there. At this point the voice said, "You open in vain, for you do not see anything there." So still puzzled, still thinking this was a joke, the witness played along. He sat down at his table and was now about 9 feet from the orb. And as the witness said, "Well, let me say welcome. Now, what gives?" This began a conversation with this apparent ET. The voice now said, "We have tried many times. Finally, you are alone. We arrived here on a big craft, and for the moment it is behind the planet Mars. For the present, we cannot bring it nearer to Earth, for we know that the Earth scientists would observe it with their telescopes, and this would create fear and panic among the people here. At the moment, we are in the Earth's atmosphere, having come here in a smaller device." So needless to say, the witness was now intrigued, because it was true that this was the first time he had been alone in nearly a month. So he asked, "What is there on the planet Mars?" The voice responded, "You will know in time." So the witness now concluded that something very unusual was happening to him, so he engaged this alleged ET in a sort of question and answer session. And he asked them, "Why do you contact just me?" And the voice replied, "Because you are one of those men of Earth who are not afraid of us." And he asked, "What makes you think so?" The voice replied, "Because we know you. We have followed you for a long time, although you do not know it yourself. Do not be surprised, for you are not the only one. By now, we have many acquaintances among the men of Earth." So he asked them, "Who, for example? Do I know one? Is there anyone in Finland?" The voice replied, "You will know later. All we ask is that as soon as you have the opportunity, you spread information about us. Tell them about us this way. We exist, and we wish people well, and we wish they would stick to the facts regarding us, making neither religions and legends nor campaigns of fear about us. Do not force them to believe in us. So he asked them, is there nothing else I could tell you? And the voice said, this time we will not tell you anything else, but you will learn more next time. He replied, I would like to see you in the same way as you know and see me. Come to the courtyard. The voice replied, it is not possible. So he insisted and said, come to that rock, pointing to a rock outside his home. And the voice said, not even that is possible. So he kept pushing and said, there's a lot of space on the sports ground. There was a sports arena near his home. The voice did not reply, so he went outside behind the Tulo ice skating rink and waited for about 10 minutes, starting to wonder if maybe he was going crazy and just imagining all this. Nothing showed up, so he returned home, and the strange orb of light was gone. But about 1 hour later, he saw a strange rippling motion where the orb had been earlier, and it now reappeared. So he turned off the ceiling light and sat down, and this weird streak of light approached him and again coiled around his chest so that he could tangibly feel it. And he told them, you did not go out there. And they said, we could not come as there are so many dogs in Tulo. And he replied, what on earth have the dogs of Tulo to do with where we meet? And the voice told him, we investigated the situation down there. It has something to do with it. The device with which we are moving can be made soundless, and if need be, invisible also, but it is emitting such a high-pitched noise that it can be heard by animals, especially dogs, and we cannot eliminate the sounds. Dogs become furious on hearing it. They can become dangerous and attack men. So at this point, the witness touched the rope of light coiling around him, but he could not feel it, and he asked them, what is this thing? There was no reply, so he continued and said, okay, let it be whatever you like. Perhaps it is a massaging apparatus. Could you massage my back with it? My back has been ailing of late. And the voice replied, we will keep your back in good condition. And at this point, this weird coil of light now began to tighten and loosen, moving slightly and repeating this process down his back. At one point it stopped, and the light now became painfully bright. The witness asked them, can you reduce that light of yours? It hurts my eyes. At that point, this coil of light wrapped around his chest, squeezed his back almost painfully, and the voice said, does this suit you? And he said, do not squeeze so hard, I'm suffocating. At that point, the grip loosened, and he asked them, how can we arrange a meeting? The voice told him, we haven't the time on this trip. We have to leave soon, as we have to stick to the timetable. We will come back after 2 years. And he asked them, why not until then? Why not sooner? And they said, the solar system from which we come, and this one of yours, will be in the most favorable reciprocal position. Go then to a desert where there are no people and no domestic animals near you, and we will join you there. So he asked them, what if he smelled of liquor or tobacco? And they told him, it would not disturb us. It is of no concern of ours, because it is a matter for you yourself. At this point the voice said, now tell us something. There was a long pause, and the voice said, we have to leave now, as we have agreed on a meeting in another place. Farewell. At that point the strange coil of light around the man's body disappeared, as did the glowing orb, and now he could smell the strange odor of disinfectant where this orb had been. And this was apparently the last visit, or if the visitors returned, the witness did not share it with investigators. How strange is that? I mean, it's really amazing. Although we didn't get to see the actual humanoids involved in this case, it's pretty apparent that there were humanoids. I also suspect that there was a follow-up to this, because they said they would return. Sadly, the witness did not come forward, so we don't know for sure. And while there are definitely absolutely unique elements to this case, we see a lot of the familiar patterns that appear over and over again. So I think it's an important and genuine case. But again, I'm just reporting the facts as we know them, and you can make up your own mind about it. So let's move to the next one. This one is super fascinating to me because there is a whole category of cases where people have an encounter not because that they are a contactee, but because they are associating with someone who has regular contact. So that's what we're seeing in this case, which I call the Nordic in the forest. This occurred 1973, 1974, thereabouts, in the Yunque forest of Puerto Rico. It's a really fascinating case, which I think you'll find really compelling. This case comes from respected researcher Jorge Martin, who published it in the article Blonde Aliens in the Yunque. This was in the Evidencia OVNI publication, issue number 16, 1997, and it was later reprinted in the Flying Saucer Review Spring 2003 issue. It is a single witness case, and the witness was a young boy at the time of his encounter, but when interviewed he was an adult, and in fact he was an electronics engineer specializing in robotics and artificial intelligence, so a good witness. Jorge gave the boy the pseudonym Pedro, as the witness did insist upon anonymity. It was in the 1970s, 1973-74. Pedro was just a young boy, and his family had become interested in an esoteric center called the Fundación Rossi, the Rossi Foundation. This is located in San Sebastian, Puerto Rico. They teach spirituality there, alternative healing, meditation, and other so-called New Age subjects. So, Pedro and his family attended weekend gatherings there, and it was there that they met a man named Carlos Ochoa, who claimed to be in contact with extraterrestrials. Carlos often spoke about his many encounters, and Pedro in particular was deeply impressed by the man and became a fervent admirer. So one day, Carlos Ochoa invited the Suarez family to spend a week with him as he was staying at his sister's home in the Yunque forest of Puerto Rico. Again, this was around 1973-74, when one evening when the moon was full, Carlos Ochoa, the contactee, stepped out of the house and began to walk into the forest. Pedro became curious and secretly followed him. And as he did so, they came to a large clearing in the forest, and suddenly Pedro realized that Carlos was no longer in sight. So Pedro decided to wait, because he figured that Carlos would likely return by the same route. And about 5 or 10 minutes later, the boy heard footsteps, and suddenly he was confronted by an amazing sight. A tall man, 7 feet tall, stood in front of him. The man had very fair hair, almost white, which swept down to his shoulders. He had very, very white skin, much like an albino, and because it was a full moon, Pedro could see this man very clearly. He wore a silver one-piece coverall, which reminded Pedro of a wetsuit, covered his arms, his legs, his whole body, and this tall man walked up to Pedro and stopped about 10 feet away. Now Pedro at this point was stunned and wanted to turn around and run away, but found himself utterly unable to move. He also said that he felt a strange feeling throughout his body, which he described as, quote, as though standing on one leg that had gone to sleep, and with a tingling feeling throughout the entire body. Now, looking at Pedro, this very tall man raised one of his hands and held it palm forward towards Pedro in a sort of greeting gesture. Instantly, the tingling sensation vanished, and Pedro found himself able to move, so he immediately turned around and fled. He said he felt completely disoriented and had a very strong sensation that he was being watched. He ran straight back to the house, and before entering it, turned around to see if he was being followed. He didn't see anything, but he still had this overwhelming feeling that he was being observed. Frightened, he ran up to the second story where his parents were talking to Carlos Ochoa's sister and told them what he had seen. Now Pedro's father was skeptical, didn't believe him, and dismissed the story as his imagination. But Carlos Ochoa's sister took his story seriously and told him, Carlos doesn't like being followed unless he has given his consent. So don't tell him you followed him, or he will be very angry. It was at that moment that Carlos entered the room and sat down. Apparently he didn't say anything, but following this event, Pedro and his family never saw Carlos Ochoa again. But it was not the end of their story, because it was not long after this encounter, Pedro's father was back at their home in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico. He was washing a boat in the front yard when movement overhead caught his eye. Looking up, he saw an immense UFO approaching. So he called out his wife and his son Pedro, and they all came out and looked at this craft. Pedro described it as, quote, gigantic and beautiful. So they watched it for about 5 minutes, during which time many other people apparently in the area also saw it. An unusual case for sure, and really quite brief in terms of how long this witness saw the humanoid, but he grew up to be a very professional person, a credible witness. Although he was a young child when he saw this, the account is so obviously sincere. And I think the fact that his father saw a UFO days afterwards or shortly after this encounter, and in fact the whole family saw it, that's probably connected to this humanoid encounter. Hard to say for sure, but if not, it's certainly an amazing coincidence or synchronicity. And it is a pattern we see in these kinds of cases. There will often be a UFO sighting prior or after a humanoid encounter. So yeah, another interesting addition to this literature of UFO and humanoid encounters. All right, let's move to the next case. You can dismiss one case or 10 or 20 or 100, but there are thousands of these humanoid cases. It's the huge number of cases, really, that to me provides the best evidence that something truly profound is going on here. And this next case is a good example. It's a very obscure case. I'm pretty sure you haven't heard it before. I call this one the Jaywalking Gray. This occurred on December 23rd, 1974 in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. It is a single witness case, but what's interesting to me about this case is there's a whole category of cases where people are driving late at night on a remote highway, and that's when they have their encounter. And that's exactly what is going on here. The witness in this case is anonymous, so I'll just call him Greg. He reported his encounter to MUFON in 2012. This was about 38 years after it occurred. It was midnight, about 1 a.m. on Christmas Eve in 1974, and Greg was heading to his home in New York, having just left college for the winter break. He was driving northbound on a highway not far from the New Jersey Turnpike in Cherry Hill, about a half hour away from the Delaware Bridge. He had offered to give a ride to a priest who was now asleep in the back seat. There were 2 northbound lanes, a large median in the center, and 2 southbound lanes. There was no other traffic on the road whatsoever, and I'll just let Greg describe what happened next. As he says, I was in the left lane when a spindly, naked, white-gray humanoid, but definitely not human, ran in front of my car. Whatever it was, ran up from my left and out from the sizable median. The median sloped down out of sight, so there was no warning of its heading my way, and I didn't see it until it was on the road. It almost immediately stopped, in the leftmost lane, right in front of me, as if it spotted my car approaching. It quickly stopped, faced me, and stood erect, acting like a deer frozen for a moment in the headlights. The expression on its face seemed one of shock, like, what was I doing there? I reciprocated, but was busy trying to slow down without losing control. It seemed thinner and more gangly than a human, possibly taller, but it may have only seemed tall due to its relative thinness, coupled with the relatively long arms and legs compared to its torso. It had no clothes. Its entire body was a uniform, dull white, or perhaps a light shade of gray. The head was hairless, and thin as well, not like any human I've ever seen. Though it faced me and was naked, I recall no other physical features. It seemed quite surprised to see me, judging by the expression of its eyes and mouth, as if it were a wild animal entering a road for the first time. I had a good look at it, for perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, before it turned in the direction from whence it had come and scampered off back into the median, down out of sight once again. Greg continued driving home and did not tell the priest what he had seen, but as Greg says, it seemed so surreal after it happened that I only shared the experience with my wife the next day and pretty much forgot about it, as I regarded it as an oddity that would remain unexplained. It wasn't until a few years ago, in the 2010s, that I read about grays. I now suspect that's what it was. A very brief case, and he only saw this humanoid for a few seconds, but certainly describes it in vivid detail. It's interesting to me how he kind of dismissed it because he did not know how to categorize this. It wasn't until years later when he started hearing about gray ETs that he realized, oh, this is what I saw. Such a shame he didn't wake up the priest that was in his car. Would have turned this into a multiple witness case, which always adds a level of credibility. But nevertheless, I think it's an important observation and certainly matches what a lot of other people have reported. So now let's move to the next case. This one was quite harrowing and frightening for the witness. I call this one, I was never so terrified in my life. This occurred on September 1975 in Canton, Ohio. And this is an unusual case because the description of the ETs is definitely not your standard gray. In fact, appears to be more like little humans. But let's just get going and you can make up your mind about what's going on here. The witness in this next case took a full 40 years to report her childhood encounter with aliens. As she writes in her report, I am relieved and terrified for telling this, all at the same time. She is anonymous, so I'll just call her Teresa. At the time of her encounter, she was 12 years old and shared a bedroom with her younger sister. They both slept in the same bed. They lived in their parents' home in Canton, Ohio. It was one evening after midnight in September 1975 when something woke her up, and looking to her left, she saw something incredibly shocking. As Teresa says, beside my bed stood two men, about 3 to 4 feet tall. They were side by side, and the one farthest away from me was passing his hands over my abdomen and thigh area, not physically touching me. I felt nothing if he did. The closest to me never moved. He was just staring straight down at my stomach area. I was never so terrified in my life. I started frantically moving my eyes around the room, trying to figure out what was happening. I immediately noticed one at the foot of my bed, with his back to me, looking towards the window directly in front of the bed. He was not moving. I then noticed one to my far right, standing in front of my chest of drawers, picking up and looking at my belongings, a hairbrush, a mirror, perfume, and a few other trinkets, and I could hear him putting them back down. I then noticed one of them standing at the doorway. It was like he was a lookout. He was standing there with his arms folded and his legs crossed. He only looked straight ahead into the hallway. So there were 5 entities total, all 3 to 4 feet tall, and all looked exactly identical. As Teresa says, they were a dark silver gray color with hats on, like a fedora hat, all the same color as their skin. No clothes. I could only see human-like features of little men. Only my eyes could move. My body was completely paralyzed. I was shaking and sweating. I could feel the sweat literally pouring off my body in fear. I tried with everything I had to touch my sister, 1 finger away, but I couldn't move my finger. So Teresa had the impression that the little man who was passing his hands over her body was the leader. He spoke to her telepathically and just kept repeating the same phrase over and over. It's okay. It's okay. This shocked Teresa, not only because of the phrase, but because it was telepathic. And that's really all she could remember. Suddenly, the next thing she knows, it's morning. She immediately recalled what happened and flew down the stairs and told her mom, who tried to convince her that it was all just a dream. But Teresa assured her mother that she was wide awake the whole time and fully aware of what was happening. She does not think it was a dream. And in fact, the effects of the encounter were far-reaching. As Teresa says, this has haunted me for 40 years. I never slept all night since then. I now take Z-Quel and wear earplugs at night, just so I can sleep. I don't know if they ever come back at night. I can't let my mind go there. So Teresa does add that she is disabled and has a lot of medical problems. She also has Rh negative blood, the only one in her family, and says that she has had many paranormal experiences most of her adult life. An interesting encounter for sure. Not a lot of people know this, but the most common place to see a humanoid is probably in your own bedroom. Bedroom visitations is what UFO researchers call these, and there are a lot of them. I do wonder if this was a one-off for the witness. I suspect not, but not being able to interview, I can't say for sure. I really do wonder what they were doing in her room like this. She wasn't able to wake up her sister. That is kind of a shame, but that's another pattern we see in a lot of these cases where one person is dead asleep and can't be woken up, and one witness is fully awake. But you can see how profoundly it affected her for the rest of her life. So that to me also speaks towards the veracity of the case. So now let's move to the next one, which I call a life-changing experience. This occurred on October 16, 1980 in Winchester, Wisconsin. This is a very rural area. This is a multiple witness case. And again, you can see that it affected the witness profoundly. But what's interesting to me, as we'll see, is the aftermath of this case. This case has not been formally investigated, but the witness, I'll call her Cheryl, that is a pseudonym, she reported her case to the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, providing a lengthy and detailed first-hand eyewitness testimony. Her encounter took place at the end of Pleasant Valley Road, a dead-end street. You can see it here. This is near Winchester, Wisconsin. It was a pretty remote location, far from any city lights at that time. It was around 9 p.m. on October 16, 1980, as Cheryl went to bed. Her husband was still awake in another section of the house. So Cheryl lay there awake in bed when she suddenly saw a flash of bright light through the bedroom window facing the driveway, and thinking that maybe they had an unexpected guest, she waited to hear a car door slam shut, but hearing nothing, she called out to her husband and he said, "No, nobody's there." Moments later, she saw a, quote, strange light, now through the other bedroom window, and it now had her full attention. As she says, "I was watching it because it was doing very strange things. It was making geometric type movements in the sky, like circles and triangles, etc. We lived near an airport, but this light was not behaving as an airplane would behave. I got out of bed and sat by the window to watch and called my husband in to see this. And as we sat there watching it, it came closer to the house. Now it appeared as a very bright white yellowish light, almost too bright to look at. At this point it was about 200 feet from the house, hovering just above treetop level. As we sat there watching it, it emitted a searchlight, rotating around on the ground and the area as though it were looking for something. And as the light came around, it shone right into our bedroom window. We looked at each other in disbelief. At this point, we decided to run outside to get a better look. So now, running outside together, they stared in wonder at this object. Because it was silent, it did not make a sound, and there was no rush of air coming from it, so it was clearly not a helicopter. At this point, the lights surrounding it dimmed, and they were absolutely amazed at what they saw. As Cheryl says, we could make out more details of the craft. It was disc-shaped with a higher area on the top. There were red lights or windows on the top part. The lights looked more like windows with a red light inside it, like a dark room that photographers use. I could see 5 or 6 silhouetted, human-like figures inside it moving around. Some of them seemed to be looking at us as we looked at them. The underside of the craft remained faintly glowing with the white-yellow light. So this craft, they estimate, was about 50 feet wide, and as it hovered there, they considered walking directly underneath it, but decided not to. They felt no fear, no sense of danger. They just watched it for about 20 minutes when they were amazed to see another craft just like the first one, but in the other direction behind their house. This one was moving very slowly, lower than treetop level. Both these craft hovered next to their house for just a few more moments, then moved slowly down the valley by their house, disappearing from sight behind the trees. As Cheryl says, I was flabbergasted and elated at the same time. I wanted to report it to someone, but who would believe us? She considered calling the police, but did not think she would be taken seriously. The next day she did call the airport and spoke with the controller, asking him if they had seen anything on radar, and his response was intriguing but non-committal. As Cheryl says, the man told me he couldn't relate any information about what they see on the radar to the public. Even if they saw something unusual, he could not talk about it. His response was worded in a way that led me to believe that they did indeed see something on the radar but could not disclose the information. So unable to get this experience out of her mind, Cheryl reluctantly decided to ask her neighbors about this. Her landlord lived next door, so Cheryl went to him and told him about seeing this UFO, and he was surprisingly receptive. As she says, he was not at all surprised by my story and said that he often saw UFOs in the valley over the years, pretty much the same thing we had seen. He said he didn't see anything that night, but he added that he had on several occasions found burned circles in the crops. He said that most of the neighbors around there knew about the UFOs and that it was sort of a local rite of passage with new people moving into the area. All the old-timers in the area were quite familiar with the phenomenon. So this encouraged Cheryl to ask another friend and neighbor who said that yes, quote, it hovered over their house for an hour late that night. And they had also seen UFOs previously. So Cheryl adds that the geography of this area does have some unique characteristics. It is particularly prone to lightning. She had even seen rare ball lightning. And in fact, it was so common, lightning, that she once herself suffered a near strike. She also said that this area was a former Native American settlement, and she added that while living there, she had many, quote, unusual dreams and clairvoyant experiences. She had no memory of any abductions. She did say that she'd always been interested in UFOs, but this encounter affected her profoundly. As she says, I have always been glad that I had this experience, because I know I am not crazy or hallucinating or making it up. It was a life-changing experience for both of us. Since then, I have never viewed life or the world we live in with ambivalence. It made me more aware of my planet and my place in the cosmos. I think that's a pretty impressive case, in that the witnesses, and there were two of them, were able to watch this UFO close up for, half an hour? So that pretty much removes any chance of misperception. So that, I think, alone makes this an important case. Also interesting to me is that so many people in this area were seeing UFOs, and in fact somebody else apparently saw this same UFO on the same night. So again, that adds more credibility to the case, but I do wonder what's going on in this area that is apparently so attractive to UFOs. The witness, as you can see, has her own theories about it. I don't know, there do seem to be certain areas that are more prone to UFO activity than others. An interesting case. So now let's move to the next one. Of all the 10 cases in this compilation, I think this one to me is the most poignant, really super interesting, because this involves 10 witnesses who were followed for many miles by this very close-up UFO with apparently a humanoid inside it. So I call this one the flying thing. This occurred one evening in fall of 1995 in a rural area near Wedowee, Alabama. And I think you'll find this an absolutely amazing and compelling case. This case comes from investigators Tom Sheets and John Thompson of Georgia MUFON. This case was also reported to New Fork and did appear in newspapers. It's a multiple witness case involving a church group of 10 ladies who one evening in the fall of 1995 were traveling together in a van from their homes in LaGrange, Georgia, to a bingo game in Anniston, Alabama. This is a 76-mile-long trip. The witnesses traveled west out of LaGrange and then north up Highway 431. It was about 7 p.m. They were almost exactly at the halfway point near Wedowee, Alabama, and were passing the poultry processing plant. And one of the ladies, a Miss P.W., a 62-year-old retired nurse's assistant, and a few of the other ladies noticed that what they first thought was a newly installed light on top of this processing plant. And one of the ladies said, "That's not a light, it's some flying thing." One of the other witnesses disagreed and said, "No, it's just a new light." And the other lady replied, "Well, if that's so, here it comes," because now this light flew down from over the poultry plant and began to pace their van. The witnesses couldn't tell how close it was to them, but estimates varied from about 15 feet off the ground to treetop level, 100 feet or so, and sometimes 50 feet away from their van to as far as 200 feet, but always pacing the van. Sometimes it went over the van, sometimes beside it. They all agreed it was globe-shaped and it glowed with a bright white light. The driver of the van, the only man on the trip, also saw the light and said it looked to him like the light was about 100 feet above the poultry power plant when they first saw it. So this object continued to pace the van, and as it did so, the ladies became increasingly frightened, especially when it came close, at which time the ladies would duck below the windows of the van, gathering up their courage to take an occasional peek to see if it was still following them, which of course it was. Mrs. P.W. kept her eyes on the object and saw what appeared to be a shape similar to, quote, a human embryo. So there was a figure inside this thing, and she said it seemed to be, quote, moving around within the light. At one point, while she and her friend looked at this object, it projected a beam of light directly at them, which hurt their eyes. Another witness described this as a, quote, a bad glare. Another described it as a sparkling effect, but several people saw this. The object would not go away, and it continued to follow them for many miles. The driver of the van would speed up, and so would the object. And when he slowed down, the object would also slow down. So this was very intentional. The object rose over the hills and dipped into the valleys, swerved around trees and other obstacles, following the terrain very closely. And in fact, when the group traveled through an underpass, you can see it here, this globe was waiting for them on the other side. It traveled with them for a total of almost 30 miles through the Hollis Crossroads area and beyond. Finally, when the group reached the intersection of Highway 431 and Interstate 20, this globe left, flew off over a field, then streaked sharply upwards, becoming a star-like object very high in the sky, and then disappeared into the distance. Following the encounter, Miss H.W. and her friend told researchers that they both developed watery and sore eyes. I like that case because it was thoroughly investigated by experienced researchers. There were so many witnesses. The researcher was able to interview 6 of the witnesses. And this is a church group. These are people who are very religious, not likely to lie. One's a nurse. I think that's always interesting because this is a person who has to be basically a trained observer and is very intelligent. So it's a really profound case. Would have loved to have been there. I suspect there probably are more witnesses, given that they were followed for nearly 30 miles. What is going on here? This looks like an intentional display to me. There's no real evidence that anyone was pulled on board or anything like that. But there are physiological effects. It's interesting because watery eyes, this sort of thing, is one of the most common physiological effects. Staring at a UFO for a prolonged period of time can sometimes cause some eye irritation. So that's apparently what was going on here, but a fascinating case all around. So now let's move to the next one. I found this one really compelling because while it is a single witness case, she saw this UFO for quite a long period of time, ignored it at first, didn't want to label it as a UFO, but once she saw the humanoids, it kind of became apparent that this was absolutely something very unusual, especially when it beamed her with a beam of light. So I call this case Beamed by a UFO. This occurred on July 9, 2007 in Fort Worth, Texas, and it's such an unusual case. The witness in this case was an employee at the ATX truck yard, a very popular entertainment spot with a bar, food trucks, a Ferris wheel, live music, and more, just north of Fort Worth. You can see it here. And it was after midnight on July 9, 2007. She had just finished her shift there and was handing it over to the next shift when she noticed a red-orange object rising up from the horizon. It was moving slowly, and it looked odd enough that she watched it for a few moments, but she had to begin her long trip home, so she headed south towards Fort Worth and finally pulled onto Interstate 20 eastbound, and this is when she looked up and saw a massive craft hovering just north of the freeway ahead of her. And as she says, it was saucer-shaped, about 2 stories high, with a wide metal band in the middle with 5 rows of colored flashing lights blinking and shifting. So she watched in amazement as these lights not only pulsated and blinked, but would change colors and directions. At this hour there was no traffic on the road, so she slowed way down to get a better look at it. She did notice what looked to her kind of like black fumes below it. She heard no noise coming from this object, but you could now hear what sounded like Chinook helicopters far off in the distance. So her first thought was that this must be some kind of hoax, perhaps put on by college students, but if so, it was, as she said, a great trick. So now she's driving alongside of it, and she could now see the side of the craft and saw that the top was actually rotating, and at this point, without warning, the craft emitted a laser-like blue beam of light onto and through her car. As she says, it was a pinpoint, and it came straight through the car, but didn't damage anything. The beam centered in my car, then rotated over me, then flattened out from a pinpoint to a flat, wide beam. The beam centered on me, then began to go up and down my body. It made an up and down pass, then went back to a point, then blinked out. So she felt no heat from this, heard no noise, but it was amazing and it confused her a little bit. She decided to speed up a little, and now looking back at the craft, she could now see the front side of it and was even more amazed at what she saw. As she says, as I watched it, I could observe an observation deck which was wide open. I could see 6 occupants, 4 grays, and 2 really tall different types. They were tall with white silver hair. They were observing the road ahead and holding hands with the grays, like parents comforting children. So the witness slowed down and saw that the craft was actually moving along the freeway, moving up and down following the elevation of the terrain, apparently pacing her car. She could still hear, but not see, helicopters off in the distance, and as the craft moved over a populated area, it crossed directly over a lighted football field, and once again she wondered if this could be a hoax. But looking at the craft, she saw that it was actually larger in diameter than the football field itself, so pretty darn big. The craft then crossed over the highway, heading south-southeast. Traffic started to accumulate at this point on the freeway, at which point, says the witness, the craft moved at an unimaginable speed, leaving streaks of light as it left. That does seem to me like a very intentional sighting, given that this witness saw the UFO as she was leaving her place of employment, drove for many miles for quite some time, and this UFO showed up again, so it looks like it was following her, and she got so close to it that these ETs, presumably ETs, were looking down at her. So yeah, this is an interactive encounter for sure, given that she was struck by this beam of light which went up and down her body as if examining her. Super interesting. And I really wonder about it. I would like to ask all these witnesses, did they have an encounter when they were young children? Did anything occur after this? What are the after effects? And so on. But an absolutely fascinating case. And also interesting to me is how she didn't want to immediately label this as a UFO. J. Allen Hynek, the father of modern ufology, talks about this, how witnesses go through what he called escalation of theory. Not really jumping to the whole UFO explanation, but trying to say, what could this be? Is this a moon? Is this a shooting star? Could this be a balloon, a helicopter, and so forth, until something happens that they realize this is absolutely unexplainable. So yeah, a good case. Now let's move to the next one. I think this one's really profound. Again, a pretty obscure case. I call this one Healed by Gray Aliens. This occurred one evening in July 2012 in Lehighton, Pennsylvania. This is not a one-off. This witness has had encounters throughout his life, but this one is apparently the most profound encounter. And it's super interesting, not only because he was apparently healed, but his encounters affected him in a very interesting way. I've often said this, that people are affected physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually on multiple levels. And we absolutely see that in this case. This next case was formally investigated by a MUFON field researcher. The witness has requested full anonymity, so I'll call him Arthur. The encounter occurred on July 23rd, 2012, which happened to be the witness's 31st birthday. At this time, he was suffering from a broken right foot from an earlier injury. Arthur had worked late that evening and was driving to a friend's house when he felt a strange, quote, warmth in his head, accompanied by a voice that told him, "Go to your parents' home." So he obeyed the voice, and at 3:30 a.m. arrived at his parents' home in Lehighton, Pennsylvania. This house is isolated on a wooded lot with no close neighbors nearby, and as Arthur pulled in, he saw that the driveway light turned off. He parked the car and exited, at which point he heard a strange metallic sound, which he described as like something hitting a rock. Now inside the house, he could hear the dogs barking frantically. So he went inside the house and looked out a small open window, and this is when he saw two large red orbs, and each of these orbs contained a short gray alien, about 3.5 to 4 feet tall. Between the orbs containing these grays and the window he was looking out, he saw about 3 6-foot-high shadows, apparently figures, as they were making blipping noises, as if they were speaking to each other. That was his impression. He felt as though they were trying to get into the house through the open window. So at this point he became a little frightened. He grabbed a stoker rod from the fireplace and went outside to chase them away. He turned the corner of the house where they were, and suddenly he found himself lying on the ground, waking up with the stoker rod lying next to him, and it was now 1 to 2 hours later. So this is a clear-cut case of missing time. He felt very disoriented, very confused and exhausted. He said it was almost like waking up from anesthesia. He did notice that his clothes were not on him correctly, as though they had been removed and put on wrong. His left leg hurt, but incredibly, his broken right foot was now healed. So he stumbled back into his car, where he waited for just a couple of hours until his mom came out to give the dogs their morning walk. He immediately told her what happened. He later learned that his stepfather was also having encounters. He also says that since he was 18 years old, he's had very vivid dreams about Einstein's theories, quantum physics, time and space, unified field theories, which all contained valid information. He would always write them down and verify the information that he got from these dreams. And staying at his parents' house, whenever he was there, he always felt that he was being watched and observed. He also mentioned one other odd synchronistic detail. Prior to his encounter, the number 31 appeared in his passwords, which was interesting to him because this encounter occurred on his 31st birthday. So interesting. While this witness was obviously quite frightened by his encounter, to be healed of a broken foot, I mean, that is amazing. And the fact that he's so profoundly affected mentally by these encounters. This is a pattern I see over and over again. People have an encounter and suddenly they're interested in quantum physics or astronomy or healing or any number of subjects. So we absolutely see that in this particular encounter. And it's just fascinating to me, and I think it's more indication that the ETs are essentially trying to wake people up to the ET presence, wake them up to their own abilities, and the fact that they're being healed. I mean, I've got 300 plus cases of people who have been healed of a wide variety of conditions, illnesses, diseases, and so forth. So I think that says a lot about who these guys are. So now let's move to the final case in this compilation. This one is super interesting to me, even though it is a single witness case and it wasn't formally investigated. This witness provides such a detailed description of the humanoid that she saw that I think it's an important case. And it's also got some really interesting and unique elements to it. Not entirely unique, I have heard them before, but I think you'll find it absolutely fascinating. The witness in this case is anonymous, so I'll call her Monica. It was one night in September 2018. She went to visit her grandparents and spend the night with them. They lived in a very rural area of Tennessee. There wasn't much traffic there, especially at night. And unable to sleep that night, she stayed up late and was lying on the couch watching TV. The living room window faced the front of the house, which had a half-circle gravel driveway with an entrance and an exit to the road. So as she lay there on the couch, she saw what looked like two headlights on a car pulling into the right entrance of their driveway. But it was strange, because only the headlights were visible. They did not illuminate the car itself, and in fact, there was no engine noise or the sound of tires on the gravel. Without warning, the lights suddenly just switched off. So this was very strange, and it frightened her. So Monica ran and woke up her grandfather, and together they went outside, and of course there was no car. This did not seem possible, as Monica was checking each window, listening very closely for the sound of someone leaving. There was no engine noise, no doors slamming, nothing. But since nothing was there, her grandfather went back to bed, and Monica returned to the living room. As she says, I was very scared and confused. I was scared it was an intruder, so I was staying vigilant by looking out the window, when all the hair on my neck stood on end, and I felt like I was being watched. For some reason, I knew to be discreet in my movement as I turned my head slightly to look into the kitchen, which was about 8 feet from where I was, when I saw an entity, about 3.5 feet tall, standing in front of the sink under the spotlight. So Monica got a very good look at this entity, and she describes it in great detail. As she says, the entity had paper white skin with a very subtle green tint, smooth skin that looked speckled with light shades of green, and a shiny look, as if it were made from plastic. It had pure black eyes, the size of a lemon, in the shape of almonds. It had no clothes, no genitalia, no nose or nostrils, just a mouth and eyes. It had no hair anywhere on its body. Its head was proportional to its body, not too large, similar to an average human. It had discolored clusters of veins on its face and body that spread in different directions. It had no muscle definition or shadows, but its body looked stocky. Its arms were slightly longer than its waist, and its legs were equal in width to its arms. I saw its chest rise and fall from what I assume is breathing. Its mouth was open, with thin, discolored lips and a full, pointed row of teeth on top and bottom, like a mouthful of human canine teeth. The strange humanoid stood perfectly still for several seconds, she said. In fact, Monica felt her blood pulsing with adrenaline, and she felt like she was in the room with a, quote, predator. As Monica says, I started thinking out of nowhere, pretend to be asleep. So I did, without hesitation, which is not how I would normally navigate a stressful situation. So I kept my eyes shut and pretended to sleep for no more than 5 minutes. I heard no sound and looked up. The thing was gone. But I know for a fact that I had not fallen asleep because I was listening for the slightest noise but heard nothing. I did not sleep until sunrise. So Monica insists this was not a dream or hallucination. The next morning, she asked her grandfather if he remembered waking her up that night, and of course, he did. Clearly a pretty scary case for the witness. what's interesting to me is how she saw this UFO immediately before the encounter, which looked very much like a car with two headlights. I've heard this description a number of times. UFOs don't have to necessarily show themselves to a witness before an encounter, but they often do. And I think there's something going on there. And the fact that it kind of mimicked a car is really interesting to me. Because yeah, I've heard that before. But her description of this ET is so amazing. And the fact that she saw its teeth and described them as sharp and pointed is also really fascinating to me, because that turns up in a number of cases I've looked into. So that, I think, is a detail that we don't often hear about, but is very consistent. Yeah, a scary case for her. It's funny to me that she pretended to be asleep. That is a reaction a number of people do have when suddenly an ET appears in the house, so I certainly understand that. A really fascinating case in so many different ways. So there you go, guys. 10 humanoid encounters I'm almost positive you haven't heard before. Let me know if you have. I'd be interested. But yeah, you can see that there's a wide variety of humanoids, almost always humanoids. I think that is a very significant detail and speaks to the fact that these guys are very much like us. This is a message contactees get over and over again. The ETs will tell them, we are you, you are us, we are one. That exact phrase, I've heard that over and over again. And ETs will tell people that basically we share a common ancestry. We share a common heritage. The point is, our relationship to them is much closer, I think, than most people imagine. They're not that different from us. And there are so many cases. The 10 here, as you know, if you watch this channel with any regularity, is just the very, very tip of the iceberg. I've already covered a couple of thousand humanoid cases at least on this channel alone. And I know for a fact from having interviewed so many people that maybe 1 in 20, that's being generous, report their encounters. I think it's probably closer to 1 in 100, particularly with humanoid encounters, because the closer the encounter, the stranger it is, the less likely a person is to report it publicly. So kudos to all these witnesses for having the courage and fortitude to speak about their cases publicly, even if anonymously. And I think it's important because it's time to move past the ridicule, the skepticism, the gaslighting, the fear, and the confusion surrounding this subject. So thank you guys. I truly appreciate you guys watching. Until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I'll see you next week for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Signing off for now. Goodbye.